In the gold rush era, nothing mattered more than distance. Gold could exist in the ground for years without changing anything. What transformed discovery into growth was not the metal itself, but access, and no form of access mattered more than the railroad. Tracks meant people. Tracks meant supplies. Tracks meant permanence. Before we begin, if you enjoy calm, documentary-style stories about real treasure, forgotten places, and the long-term consequences of historical decisions, consider liking the video and subscribing. It quietly supports the continuation of stories like this. Across the United States, dozens of gold towns were built on the assumption that railroads would arrive next. Streets were laid out to meet stations that did not yet exist. Warehouses were positioned beside empty corridors of land where tracks were expected to run. According to historical records, railroad expansion was often announced years before construction reached its destination. Maps were printed. Routes were proposed. Timelines were discussed publicly. For many gold towns, the railroad was not a possibility, it was treated as an inevitability. But inevitability depends on timing. This is not a story about railroads that failed. It is a story about railroads that stopped short, about tracks that ended miles away, about stations that were planned but never built, and about towns that waited for trains that never came. Gold could attract attention. Railroads turned attention into commitment. According to contemporary accounts, towns connected to rail lines experienced rapid transformation. Supplies arrived cheaply. Heavy equipment became practical. Families followed workers. Institutions followed families. Railroads compressed distance. They reduced weeks of travel to days. They made bulk transport possible. They stabilized supply chains that otherwise depended on weather, terrain, and chance. For gold towns without rail access, everything remained fragile. Equipment had to be hauled by wagon. Food costs fluctuated wildly. Profits shrank under transport expenses. What looked viable on paper became marginal in practice. Later, historical analysis indicates that rail access often mattered more than the richness of the gold itself. Modest deposits connected to rail lines outperformed richer fields that remained isolated. This created a dangerous assumption. Towns believed that once gold was proven, railroads would follow. Investors planned accordingly. Land values reflected future access rather than present reality. Railroads became embedded in expectation. Streets were aligned toward imagined stations. Businesses positioned themselves along projected routes. Entire local economies oriented toward infrastructure that existed only on maps. And as long as the railroad remained promised, waiting seemed reasonable. The problem was not that railroads never expanded. The problem was that expansion had limits, and many gold towns sat just beyond them. Railroads did not arrive by accident. They followed decisions, political, financial, and strategic, made far from the towns that waited for them. According to historical records, most railroad routes were determined not by local need, but by capital efficiency. Companies prioritized connections between major ports, established cities, and regions that promised immediate return on investment. Gold towns rarely fit that profile. They were remote. Their output was uncertain. Their populations fluctuated seasonally. Yet promises were made. Railroad executives spoke optimistically about future extensions. Politicians repeated those projections to encourage settlement. Newspapers printed speculative maps that showed tracks reaching places still connected only by dirt roads. These promises were really lies. They were conditional statements presented as inevitabilities. Once production increases, once population stabilizes, once financing is secured. Contemporary accounts suggest that many town leaders actively amplified these projections. Land was sold based on proximity to future stations. Businesses advertised themselves as soon to be rail-connected. Expectation became a shared narrative. The railroad did not need to exist to influence behavior. It only needed to feel close enough to justify planning around it. In many cases, town founders and investors genuinely believed they were aligned with larger expansion plans. They were not deceived. They were optimistic within a system that rewarded forward projection. The problem was that railroad decisions were revisited constantly. Routes shifted. Priorities changed. Budgets tightened. And each revision pushed some towns further down the list until they quietly fell off it altogether. The promise of the railroad lingered longer than the likelihood of its arrival. Railroads rarely announced where they would stop. Instead, endings revealed themselves gradually through silence, delay, and redirection. According to historical records, many gold towns found themselves located just beyond the final railhead. Trains reached nearby hubs, then halted. Extensions were discussed, surveyed, and postponed. Maps showed dotted lines where tracks were supposed to go. Those dotted lines carried enormous weight. Contemporary accounts describe towns measuring distance not in miles, but in expectations. 10 miles felt close. 20 felt manageable. 50 still seemed possible. But railroads did not expand incrementally. They advanced in leaps driven by financing cycles and political momentum. When expansion paused, it paused decisively. The last station became permanent. The railhead hardened into a boundary. Beyond it, transport remained slow and expensive. Wagons replaced trains. Costs rose. Time stretched. Later, historical analysis indicates that towns just beyond rail access suffered disproportionately. They were close enough to compete with rail-connected towns, but far enough to lose. Gold shipments became marginally profitable. Supplies became marginally expensive. Every calculation hovered just below viability. These towns existed in a narrow economic gap, too distant to benefit, too close to relocate. The tracks did not bypass them dramatically. They simply stopped, and once stopped, they rarely resumed. The physical end of the railroad became a psychological one as well. The future that had felt near suddenly felt fixed elsewhere. The town had not been rejected. It had been excluded by inertia. When railroads stopped short of gold towns, the consequences were not evenly distributed. Some places lost, others quietly gained. According to historical records, the towns that became final railheads often experienced an artificial surge of importance. Warehouses, transfer yards, hotels, and supply depots clustered at the last station. Everything beyond that point had to pass through them. Delay created concentration. Merchants in railhead towns profited from transshipment fees. Freight was unloaded, reloaded, stored, and resold. Prices increased with distance from the tracks, and that distance translated directly into margin. Contemporary accounts describe railheads becoming regional bottlenecks. Gold from isolated towns flowed backward through them. Supplies flowed forward at a cost. Time itself became a commodity. Railroad companies also benefited. By stopping where returns were predictable, they minimized risk. Extending tracks into uncertain territory required capital, labor, and long-term commitment. Ending lines early preserved flexibility. The railroad could promise future expansion without incurring immediate cost. Speculators adjusted quickly. Land near railheads rose in value. Businesses relocated. Investment followed certainty rather than promise. Towns once considered temporary suddenly became permanent nodes, not because of gold, but because of access. Meanwhile, the gold towns waiting beyond the line absorbed the downside. They paid higher transport costs. They lost competitive advantage. They watched opportunity consolidate elsewhere. The railroad did not need to choose winners explicitly. It only needed to stop moving. And where it stopped, power accumulated. For gold towns located just beyond the railroad, The cost was not immediate failure, it was erosion. According to historical records, these towns often remained active for years after rail expansion halted. Mining continued. Businesses operated. People stayed. But every transaction carried friction. Equipment wore out faster because replacement was slow. Food prices fluctuated unpredictably. Profits thinned under transport expenses that rail-connected competitors did not face. Contemporary accounts suggest that residents understood this disadvantage clearly. The railroad was close enough to see, close enough to imagine, and close enough to feel unreachable. This proximity mattered psychologically. Towns far from rail access adapted differently. They developed alternative supply chains or accepted isolation. But towns just beyond the line lived in constant comparison. Every mile mattered. Every delay reinforced dependence. Later, historical analysis indicates that these towns experienced a gradual outflow of capital rather than people at first. Investment shifted toward railheads. Expansion plans were shelved. Maintenance replaced development. The cost accumulated quietly. Opportunities missed in 1 year compounded into stagnation over decades. By the time decline became visible, the railroad's absence was no longer the only problem. It had shaped the town's entire economic trajectory. The line had been drawn elsewhere, and once drawn, it defined not just access, but fate. Long before the first rail spike could have been driven, many gold towns began building as if the railroad were already real. According to historical records, streets were widened to accommodate freight traffic that never arrived. Warehouses were constructed larger than current demand justified. Lots were reserved for stations, depots, and switching yards that remained empty parcels of land. These were not mistakes. They were investments in a future that seemed imminent. Businesses positioned themselves along projected rail corridors rather than existing roads. Hotels expanded capacity in anticipation of travellers who never booked rooms. Local governments issued permits and allocated space for infrastructure that existed only in planning documents. Contemporary accounts describe a strange asymmetry. Towns physically prepared for growth, while daily life remained small and provisional. Buildings stood ready, but lightly used. Capacity exceeded reality. This anticipation shaped how resources were allocated. Money flowed into preparation rather than diversification. Instead of adapting to isolation, towns doubled down on connection. Alternatives were postponed. Local solutions were treated as temporary measures, soon to be replaced by real access. The expectation of arrival displaced the need for adjustment. Later, historical analysis indicates that this pattern created structural rigidity. When the railroad failed to arrive, towns were left with infrastructure designed for a scale they never reached, and ill-suited for the scale they remained. What they built was not excessive. It was premature, and once built, it anchored them to an imagined future rather than an adaptable present. Waiting does not just delay outcomes, it reshapes identity. In towns expecting rail access, the sense of self became forward-looking by necessity. Residents described their communities not as they were, but as they would soon be. According to contemporary accounts, local newspapers framed the present as transitional. Advertisements emphasized proximity to future rail lines. Town leaders spoke in timelines rather than realities. This language mattered. It trained people to see the present as incomplete, something to endure rather than invest in. Pride attached to potential rather than achievement. Stability felt temporary, even when it lasted decades. Later historical analysis suggests that this forward-leaning identity had lasting effects. When the railroad did not arrive, the absence was not just economic, it was existential. The town had defined itself by what it was about to become. Without the railroad, that definition collapsed quietly. Not into crisis, but into ambiguity. Residents struggled to articulate what the town was for once its central promise dissolved. Some adapted by lowering expectations. Others left in search of places where identity felt settled. Those who stayed inherited a place shaped by deferred purpose. Institutions existed without clear justification. Infrastructure outpaced demand. The town felt prepared, but not grounded. Waiting became normalized. The railroad was no longer discussed actively, but its absence still structured decisions. Growth was always assumed to be possible someday, even as evidence suggested otherwise. The town's identity remained suspended between anticipation and acceptance, and that suspension became its most enduring feature. Waiting for a railroad is different from waiting for people. Trains are mechanical. They follow schedules. They imply certainty. In gold towns expecting rail access, this created a particular psychological state. According to contemporary accounts, residents interpreted delay not as denial, but as postponement. The logic was simple. Steel tracks do not change their minds. They only arrive late. This belief softened doubt. People adjusted timelines rather than expectations. Each missed season was reframed as temporary. Each delay was absorbed into the assumption that arrival was still inevitable. Waiting became structured. Businesses synchronized plans to projected rail schedules. Local governments postponed alternative investments. Families delayed decisions about relocation or diversification. Later historical analysis suggests that this form of waiting is especially resistant to correction. Because the object of anticipation is impersonal, infrastructure rather than behavior, it feels less subject to reversal. The train did not choose not to come. It simply had not come yet. This distinction mattered. It allowed hope to persist without evidence. It reduced urgency. It made inaction feel rational rather than risky. Over time, this psychology narrowed the range of possible futures. Towns invested less in self-sufficiency. They defined success as connection rather than adaptation. The longer the wait continued, the harder it became to imagine growth without the railroad. Even when mining remained viable, the absence of rail access framed every limitation. The train shaped thinking even in its absence. And by the time it was clear that it would never arrive, the habit of waiting had already reshaped the town's capacity to respond. The regional consequences of railroads stopping short extended far beyond individual towns. According to historical records, areas with early rail access developed denser economic networks. Supply chains stabilized. Markets integrated. Capital circulated locally rather than leaking outward. Regions without rail access experienced the opposite. Gold flowed out. Supplies flowed in at a cost. Value accumulated elsewhere. This created a lasting spatial imbalance. Rail-connected towns became anchors. They attracted population, investment, and institutions. Surrounding areas oriented themselves toward these nodes, reinforcing their dominance. Gold towns left beyond the rail line were gradually reclassified, not officially, but functionally. They shifted from centers of growth to peripheral suppliers. Later historical analysis indicates that this hierarchy persisted even after mining declined. Railheads evolved into administrative, commercial, and transportation hubs. Former gold towns struggled to redefine themselves once their original economic role faded. The absence of rail access shaped infrastructure for generations. Roads replaced tracks, but later and less efficiently. Services arrived slowly. Opportunities clustered unevenly. The original decision to stop the railroad continued to influence development patterns long after the gold was gone. The region did not fail uniformly. It differentiated. Some places became permanent centers. Others remained dependent. The railroad did not just determine movement. It determined memory, relevance, and long-term capacity. Where the tracks ended, history accelerated. Where they did not reach, time slowed. Railroads that never reached gold towns reveal a quiet truth about how history actually moves. It is not shaped only by discovery. It is shaped by connection. Gold existed in these towns. Work continued. Lives were built around extraction and effort. Nothing was imaginary except the arrival of the train. According to historical records, the decision to stop a railroad was rarely dramatic. There was no single announcement, no official rejection. Expansion simply paused, then redirected. Attention shifted elsewhere. For the towns waiting beyond the tracks, that pause became permanent. They were not wrong to expect the railroad. Their assumptions were reasonable. They followed patterns that had worked before. What they could not control was timing, and timing proved decisive. The railroad did not need to destroy these towns to define them. It only needed to stop short. What followed was not collapse, but endurance without leverage. Towns persisted, adapted, and survived, but always within limits set by an absence that never fully resolved. They waited long enough for the future to change shape. The tracks became a boundary not just on the map, but in memory. Places with real access entered the national story. Places without it faded into footnotes, regardless of how much gold they produced. This story is not about failure. It is about proximity, about being close enough to expect connection and far enough to never receive it. And it leaves one final question. If progress depends less on what is found and more on what arrives, how many places were shaped not by what they had, but by what never reached them?